welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your co-MC Rich.
And I'm your co-MC Rach.
And today we have Kamala Kara from Far Horizons Co-op. How are you doing, Kamala?
I'm doing pretty good. Can't complain.
Welcome. We're glad to have you on. Let's kick this off with our standard how you doing question. How long have you been playing PBTA games, and what was your gateway?
So, back on the Something Awful forums, I want to say right after they released the guide on Dungeon World that they made, maybe that game, Dungeon World we played a few games of that. I think that was a lot of people back then's gateway just because it's easy to digest, and I never saw Mad Max, so Apocalypse World wasn't as easy to get into, though I have played it since. It was very fun.
I was going to say, I think Dungeon World in particular is a good jumping on point for people of a certain era of PBTA.
I think probably the new jumping on point is Masks, but yeah, back then it was all Dungeon World, I think.
Let's jump on over here and let's read a sitch. Read a sitch. On Read a Sitch, what we do is ask our guests to highlight a particular aspect of tabletop play, maybe a journal play, observations they have about an ongoing PBTA game. Kamala, you had mentioned the possibility of talking about how to tell stories during combat scenes or using combat scenes to tell stories. I'm not sure which way you wanted to go with that. Let's kick it off. What are your thoughts around using combat? I know you mentioned Masks. We're going to be talking about your game, so I assume this is something you have a good deal of experience with.
So I'm a forever GM. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that term. As a side effect of GMing a lot of games, you're never going to be put in a situation where you are going to have to run a combat while also balancing the fact that, sure, there are some gamers out there who legitimately enjoy the actual tactical feeling of a role-playing game combat scene. And to those who do, absolutely, that's cool and awesome. But people always prefer the story behind it. Even if it's a small story, you always have to make something along to sort of add some, in my experience actually, maybe I'm completely off base here, but you always have to do something to add a little bit of oomph, something to tie back. I mean, in my experience, every game session, you usually have to find one thing the character, each player, finds cool, and you got to find a way to bring it in.
I like the idea that you presented of combat being a little story, like a bit of narrative with a beginning, a middle, a climax, and an end. Have you intentionally crafted a combat to have that narrative arc, to give it a little bit more meaning rather than, okay, you all gang up and you punch the bad guy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, an example would be, so a lot of shonen stuff usually has like some sort of power system.
Mm-hmm.
And one sort of factor that came up was after a big fight between two of the player characters against each other, because in the first round they only fought NPCs, and in the second round that for this promo game we had them fight each other. And after the person who only used weapons and didn't have any key-based powers saw the two key-based people fight and was now going to fight an NPC because we had an odd number of players, they intentionally chose not to use their weapons. They start off not using the thing they're used to using against someone who absolutely was going ham with their key-based powers. So the player character starts off trying to essentially unlock their power in the middle of this fight. So it starts off with them sort of on the defense. They're not in their element. They're not using what they primarily use. So they end up sort of on the defensive there, trying to figure out how to mimic what they were seeing. Eventually in the middle sort of turn things around. But we're actually about to lose because in the back of the book, we mentioned there's rules for being pulled out of the ring, so they're about to be knocked out. And at the last second, they managed to pull off a victory.
Mm-hmm.
And we narrated that by having that be them finally awakening to their powers and actually blowing the other person out of the ring with it. Kind of like a sudden burst of energy, a very common thing in dramatic storytelling. When you unlock a new ability, it's both a narrative thing of them growing and not using the things that they was holding them back, and simultaneously also it resulting in a victory.
Do you find it useful to, after you have a combat scene with a heavy narrative focus, to have an emotional scene in the aftermath to reaffirm those, as you were saying, like the physical does not always coexist with the emotional, but to give more space to sort of let it tie all back together?
I actually personally find that happens whether or not I have any influence as the GM. If the players allowed a scene like that to happen, and really I think maybe that's the right term, because they're the ones who are really making that emotion, you're just facilitating it. You're feeling it along with them, but they're the ones who are really making that scene happen. It will just happen whether or not you want it to, because if they are enjoying that ride of this emotion, just naturally they're going to want to do sort of a wind down scene that continues it and sort of moves on from there.
Well, you've mentioned this shonen fighting, and maybe we want to jump on over here and open our brain up to it. What do you say we talk a little bit about friendship, effort, victory? Open your brain.
In Open Your Brain, our guest will discuss a Apocalypse Engine game that they've worked on. Kamala, talk to us a little bit about friendship, effort, victory. Or is it like friendship, effort, victory? What's it about?
It probably is the screamed version, but my throat hurts and I'm not doing that. So what's it about is... So when I was a teenager, there's 3 really big comics that had come over from Japan, often called manga. I'm going to be a little general here. And they were Bleach, Naruto, and One Piece. Now, of those, Naruto is arguably the most popular one, but they all kind of had a similar vibe to them because they all came from the same magazine, the same company, and for years it had the same tropes, and it reminded me a lot of Dragon Ball Z, and that's because it's from the same company, same tropes, different writers, of course, but they're all influenced from each other. So FEV tries to go for those kinds of feelings, which I kind of boiled down some similar elements, sort of the tropes of the genre. But using those series that I like Bleach, Naruto, One Piece, I tried to craft a game that emulated that kind of story. So the elements I sort of identified were usually you have someone very young, because they're usually coming of age stories to some degree, usually around the teenage years of a person, probably because that's what the primary demographic is, so people want to relate to the characters. These kids are usually born in a world that are fantastical in some way, even if they're not initially aware of it, where there's something kind of wrong about it, if you would. I know this sounds a little generic, but it's not. It's all. I'm taking it that way because it's not always obvious that something's bad. Because Naruto takes a little while, for example, to get to the fact that yes, they are all child soldiers. And that's a bad thing.
It's very reminiscent generally in coming-of-age stories when the protagonist gains a wider worldview and suddenly they have to reconcile what they assumed the world was going to be versus what the truth of the world is, and then usually what are they going to do about it, right?
You are absolutely right. Because that does end up happening in this coming-of-age narrative. But then there's also a very special way that Shonen Battle comics love to do it, where there's this emphasis on flash and emotion that's really hard to describe, but it's more like just really raw energy, I find, in a lot of these works. Just this impotent rage that a lot of teenagers have about how things they feel could be better, even if the protagonists are kind of happier characters. They'll still have those moments where they're confronted, and it's just this passion. Passion's a very big thing. Also, training and getting better, of course, I have to mention that, is a very big factor in it as well. Just this notion that they get better, they get stronger over time. This notion of self-improvement. The game's title, I'm just going to say this, I'm jumping all over the place, but the game's title is Friendship, Effort, Victory, which is both the tagline of the comic company that comics inspired this, but also adequately describes a lot of the elements that are core to these stories. There's always this core element that I forgot to mention just now, but friendship, this core element of bonds between people being very important, even in series where that's looser.
It's very reflective of that high energy emotions of teenagerhood, and you're developing relationships with your inner circle. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing your game has the tools to explore those relationships and go between player characters?
Yes, they do. So it does that in a few different ways.
How are those mechanics and other mechanics different in your game versus Apocalypse World?
First off, there's a big element called ties, which on its surface might seem a little similar to Apocalypse World because it does have, if I remember correctly, a similar mechanic.
Yes, it has history.
But there's a lot of interplay with the moves to sort of grain these ties, and it's how you gain those ties, reinforce that narrative of it coming about. For example, one of the main ways you actually get ties on another character is in a fight. But a lot of the archetypes sort of play in with that system. Also, the friendship and enemy move system that is a little bit more in the background, but is still there. These two moves that trigger with every playbook that usually gets them closer or farther away from another character. Work together to tie together those bonds a little bit more.
How do you use ties in the battle system?
What ends up being a big central point of this game of the genre, really, are these big climactic battles. So the battle system ends up being the heart of the game in some ways. It gets some of the most narrative space, but it's not a traditional battle system because it's not like counting squares or feet or what have you. But this is more of a battle system more focused on the narrative elements, which I know sounds be a little generic.
Do you have a good example of how the battle system reinforces the narrative?
Yes. So you have the central core mechanic in the main battle mode of fighting a serious battle. This ends up becoming sort of your main move where everything sort of flows into for the combat. So the first thing about it is that the move itself tells you to take a step back, in my opinion, and I think this is one of the better parts of the move, is take a step back and recognize that you're not really supposed to worry about every punch, every kick. That's not really where we're focusing on here. So a lot of the smaller things, we can kind of let that go for a little bit, narrate that out, build your momentum until you hit those big moments where the artist is going to really bust out their pens and draw that 2-page spread or do a full page on what's going on here. Or just it's very emotional. And from there, from the results of that move, when you finally do pick up the dice, those moments that matter. So not every little punch and kick. You kind of then spin out into other things. This might be a good way of putting it. The only way you can change an enemy's opinion, which is a very common thing, is that you have to be fighting them and get their ear so you can prove them wrong. Because only in those big moments where you really hurt that bad guy can you actually open them up to having their opinions changed. Which, maybe there's some issues with that if applied to the real world, but maybe. But in the context of the genre, that is a very common trope that the hero and villain, or hero and their friends even, when they do fight against each other, can only really talk for their fists. By proving them wrong, you can change sort of their opinion and grow a bond with them that might actually end up making them work with you afterwards, because we do have a little saga system where at the end of every main villain being defeated, you kind of get like a little bit of a reset, because it was a way of dealing with the fact that advancement in PBTAs, I personally don't think it works too long if the game goes on for too long, unless characters are constantly retiring. So one way you could actually do it is you could absolutely play a villain who had turned good, or a general who has turned good, or at least turned to an anti-hero. Well, one thing I would actually want to mention real quick, because this is something that is a big difference from Apocalypse World. How do I handle the health system? It's actually by having 2 health systems. And this actually does tie in a little bit to the narrative element of the combat. Now, of course, it's just the basic health system, which was basically just made by taking the harm clock and turning it into a status track. With one big caveat being that I was inspired by a game called Tenra Bancho Zero that had a thing called the Dead Box, where your character could never die unless the Dead Box was checked. No matter what happened, if the Dead Box was not checked, your character could not die. Which I thought was a great solution to the problem of lethality in Apocalypse World games. I mean, every game does it, but death has to be on the table at some point in a shonen jump thing, to tell you the truth. Character death absolutely happens. So it does need to be on the table. It's not out of genre, but it's not common at all. It's actually extremely rare. What happens is if you check the Dead Box, you immediately get inspired, which if you've ever seen Fellowship, that's where I got the idea from. You roll 3d6, you make the better 2 for the match, and you kind of heal back up. But no matter what happens, your character's going to die at the end of this. So you basically get to go out in a blaze of glory. You might be saying, well, couldn't someone do that to beat the villain? I don't know if I want to get into that, but there is mechanics where the villain's survival is tied to his generals. So beating him might automatically remove one of his generals, but they can't be defeated until that mechanic is dealt with. But no matter what, you can still have a blaze of glory, defeat the other person, If you're fighting a villain, you automatically remove one of the requirements to ultimately beat the villain without having to deal with said requirement directly. But your character dies. So maybe you don't want to check the dead box to win a fight. What else do you do? Well, borrowing a little bit from Masks and a little bit from Smallville, there's conditions, which ties into the narrative element of fight, where you can, instead of taking physical damage, you can absorb it all by just getting emotional. Which I thought fit really well, actually, that this character just completely tanked this attack because they're just really angry right now, or they're just really, like, feeling guilty and they have to keep going. Like, whatever emotion it was, it just sort of made sense that in a shonen game, they can tank an attack just by being really emotional afterwards. I personally felt that fit the genre very well.
What's your favorite move in the game and why?
Okay, that one is definitely spectating the big fight, because that solved a big problem that actually also existed in the game, is that shonen battles are one-on-one fights. You usually don't have a situation where, a bunch of people are fighting. I mean, that happens, but it's not the norm in the genre. There's tournament arcs are really common. That's usually what you do when the series isn't doing well, is you do a tournament arc, and those are almost always one-on-one fights. That's actually the reason you do a tournament arc. So the question you then run into is, what do you do? Because what is everyone else going to do? Just sit around and watch you two fight? Like, it was a problem that had to be dealt with at some point. There had to be a move to handle the spectating, in my mind, because a really common trope is that the characters will be watching this fight, and then one guy will just be like, oh, he might be looking really good, but actually she got him really good, and he's actually really hurting, and he's hiding it. And then, like, they'll cut to that character, and they're, like, basically confirming everything that guy just said is true, either by internal monologue or some sort of hint to let you know that, yeah, that's right. And normally that was like a crutch that existed because comic books have always had that issue. Western comics have to use narrators back in the day. They get around the fact that since you're only seeing snippets of it in sequence and not like live action, it can be a little hard to get the subtle movements you need to get across that this event actually occurred sometimes if it's subtle and hard to draw, or it would take too much page space. But it kind of ended up being that, like, perfect, like, moment of, like, that's how I can get people constantly involved in the fight. But just this notion of just everyone is watching the scene as well. But if they make a comment on it, it actually has a tangible effect on it. So even if their character's not fighting, even if their character's not even physically being present, I make clear that they can still comment on it, because that also happens, where the characters are just speculating on how the fight is going, and they get it exactly right, and that ends up being like how the story builds up to it. So it's like, you don't even have to be present, but it ends up still making the spectators, the people watching the fight, actually have like this effect, like they can actually affect the battle itself.
That reminds me of a World Wide Wrestling RPG as well, which had a similar problem, and they dealt with it in a similar way of people being announcers. That's cool.
I love that game too. That's a great game.
Kamal, I gotta say, I'm really interested to see how this all like puts together on the table. Would you be interested in hopping over here to Act Under Fire and give us a quick demo of Friendship, Effort, Victory?
Absolutely.
It is time to act under fire.
In Act Under Fire, our guest will run us through a quick scene or give us a demo of the game that we've been talking about. So I think that there might be a fight scene in this Friendship, Effort, Victory. I don't know, though. Kamal, you tell us. What do you want us to do? Let's kick it off.
The roar of the crowd is deafening as this, suavely dressed, blonde-haired man comes out with a microphone and announces, "Welcome all to the World Martial Arts Tournament. You've all come here from around the world to see the greatest fighters duke it out to prove who's the best and win that prize money. You've seen many fights from the preliminaries to the main matches to the semifinals, and here we are, the final match." That is when he's going to introduce a Rich character. Where, Rich, can you describe your character a little bit, give their name, and just a little bit about themselves as he sort of ushers you in, giving you your cue to enter?
You bet. I am playing my normal signature character of Plussy. He stands very, very tall. Maybe he's 6 feet, maybe he's 7 feet. We don't know. He's built I think he has a 12-pack. I don't know. It's like so many muscles. There's muscles on muscles. He's bold and very confident and tough because he is the playbook of the Guardian, where the Guardian is all about looking tough and making sure everyone knows that they're tough. But secretly, they just might be a little bit of a softie because they actually care about making sure that the right people aren't hurt. Yeah, so that's Plussy as he steps out, stripped to the waist, wearing some cool like Aikido pants and bare feet under the shining sun. So it's like a ding little sunlight that bounces off of his little lens flare occasionally. That's Plussy, the big Guardian.
Okay, so after that, you're coming out to the roar of the crowd, and that's when the announcer then moves out his other arm, which summons Rach forward to introduce their character.
I'm going to be playing Curtis, but Curtis in like edgy shonen battle flavor because he is the rival. He is much shorter than Plussy. I would say about 5'6", kind of averagey, but he's dressed in these training clothes. They are a bit flashy, but they're designed to be loose and allow flexibility in a martial arts competition. He's got a serious look on his face because you see Curtis has decided that Plussy is his rival, because how dare Plussy be so naturally gifted and talented and able to stand up for others? He's going to prove himself by beating the crap out of Plussy, because I think that's how these types of stories roll.
So the announcer turns back around to you both and says, "I want a nice, clean match. Let the World Tournament final bout commence." And that's when he moves his arm down and jumps off of the stage. Now, normally we actually have some extra rules in the back for tournaments, but just for the sake of keeping things simple, we're not going to use those rules.
Okay.
I think this is an important time to mention that as Curtis the rival, I do have the move, "Finally We Fight," which is when you fight your rival, I gain a tie on Plussy, and Plussy gains a tie on me. What do those mechanically do?
They generally can be used to affect the rules and affect the harm being dealt and affect the final result of the roll. So you have that there, and that's where it kind of ties into being able to help and harming each other, because there actually really isn't a help-harm mechanic. There's the tie mechanic. One thing that also needs to be mentioned is you can always offer them to each other if they're willing to listen to what you have to say. So if you are trying to reach out to them, you can actually spend that tie to give them experience if they're willing to listen to you. So those are the main mechanics there. It's different with NPCs, but we don't need to go into every single part.
Okay, Curtis looks Plussy up and down and says, "I knew you wouldn't be brave enough to throw the first punch. And then I would like to use a technique to try to punch Plussy in the back." I want to say backstab a little bit, but I'm going to hold back just a bit, but I want to hit you in your blind spot.
Oh my.
Physically, not just metaphorically.
You're using a technique, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to pull dice out at this moment. That's an important thing to mention. If you go for every single hit, even when there's not as much motion built up to it, it's kind of like overusing 2-page spreads. You run for your budget, you run for your page space, and it has diminishing returns. So you're opening the fight right now. This is something where the GM kind of and the players have to work together to sort of build that sort of energy. I don't think that opening move is going to be like something we need to get the dice for yet. I mean, it sounds like what you're really doing is the nothing personal kid meme, and you're just teleporting behind them and attacking them.
Yes.
Which is absolutely the way we can start that off. Basically, you're teleporting behind them, you're going back, you're hitting them, and now this is where we got that kind of back and forth here a little bit as well. So, Rich, how much force do you think goes into that? How much would that hit a character that's this buff, this tough? Would they be knocked back by the move? Would they tank it? What is more in character for them?
He did not expect Curtis to strike from a blind spot, and he's more shocked than anything. I think he staggers forward a few steps, maybe drops to a knee, looks back. Curtis, there are rules.
I'm pretty sure this is within the rules of the tournament. And he looks visibly disappointed that Plussy is mostly just staring in horror.
Yeah, you're here for a fight. I mean, come on. They're not fighting you at all? God, doesn't that piss you off?
Oh, it does piss me off.
the only way they're going to get out of being such a wuss is you got to beat them up a little bit more, don't you think? You got to get them to take you seriously.
There is the move, prove them wrong. I might have Plusy's ear right now.
Oh.
I think Curtis might say, it's a tournament. It's a competition. We're supposed to fight.
I don't know. You know what? Normally you get that move by rolling, but I think you're right. This is a moment where they are paying attention to you. Absolutely have their ear on that. So you might have noticed all it says is roll 2d6 for a lot of these moves. I had the worst trouble finding a stat system that ended up working for this game, and ultimately I thought the smartest solution was actually not to have one. As a result, instead of having a stat system, all of the ranges were just changed by 1, which basically means it's as if you have a +1 to every move, with the focus more being on ties and inspiration coming from your moves, coming from your bonds, to actually kind of subtly move narrative focus and mechanical focus away from your static stats and more towards these other elements that are more tied to the emotional bond building side of the game. But yeah, so I would say you're about right. So why don't you roll 2d6 for me?
I rolled 2d6. That's a 10.
Wow.
Okay, so you get both. So, Plusy, you have to actually take both of these. So this is sort of a standard thing. You might be familiar with these two options here, but right now they want you to take this fight seriously, and they want you to fight, and they want you to go all out. They want you to not hold back. Now, if you do it, you can mark experience, and if you refuse, they hold 1, and they can spend that hold to leave you in shock. That means you roll 3d6 and take the worst 2 results, which statistically is really bad. So if you don't stand up to their challenge right now, them questioning your sort of recalcitrance to fight, recalcitrance to give everything to really end your rivalry because you care about them, then they're going to use it against you and they're going to hurt you. As a matter of fact, that really kind of fits your narratively a lot if you think about it, because if you refuse, they're probably just going to go for a really bad punch and hurt you badly. But if you do it, you're going to mark experience, you're going to grow a little bit from the event. So the question, of course, as is often the case in PBTA, is what do you do?
There's, of course, 2 to 3 panels of his fretting over having to fight his rival. Maybe there's some internal dialogue as he thinks about, but what if I have to hurt Curtis? He's so small and he really needs help, and I can see how much he wants to win. Maybe I should throw the fight.
Oh, that's the worst thing you do.
But no, I fought to be here. Then he turns and says, Very well, Curtis. You made your way all the way to the finals, then you deserve a good fight. But understand that when I defeat you, that second place is very important too.
If you defeat me.
He's going to try to lay Curtis out.
Okay, can you describe how you try to lay them out?
You bet. I believe I will be using, by the way, I give full credit to one of the playtesters because these techniques are awesome and I had to borrow them. So Aura, the technique
That's
of
Amber's.
Unleashing a barrage of punches fast enough to leave behind after images that create the illusion of multiple fists punching together. And I unleash this technique immediately on Curtis because I know there's a first aid tent not far away. So after he falls, possibly dead, we'll make sure that he's brought back. But I may be crying inside as I beat the living crap out of him.
It's fine. My death box isn't marked off.
Usually everyone's really down with the idea that fighting is the ultimate solution to combat. And I just love that there's this character who's apparently really talented and super strong. And they hate fighting.
He's fighting his VIP. This is Curtis. I care about Curtis. I don't want to.
This is a flashback when we grew
him.
up together. We were small kids.
Yeah, and I was riding a bike, and you still had the training wheels, and I'm like, no, it's going to help you build up your muscles.
Okay, so you're punching at them with that kind of force. Why don't we actually roll a little bit of showing off fighting a serious battle? Because they wanted the tiger, they wanted the beast, and now you're giving it to them.
Okay. So fighting a serious battle, when a sequence leads up to a big spot or a key moment in the fight, then I roll. And I don't have to worry about modifiers because there are none. So I'll roll my 2d6. Here we go. I've rolled an 8 on a 6+. You hit him hard. The opponent takes harm and you are hit by their counterattack.
So it's basically you're trading harm for harm right now, but you do have some options from below, as you will see.
Yeah, you get to pick one of the options. Your opponent's winded and staggered. Your strike is powerful and breaks their defenses. You block their counterattack, take less harm from them. Your display of prowess impresses them, or you have their ears prove them wrong. I think I will go with your opponent is winded and staggered. You're inspired against them.
So you basically are shooting these punches out. And, Curtis, one reason you've always disliked Plessy is that he is naturally gifted. And one of the bigger insults here is that he wasn't taking this seriously, and this hurts a lot. He just, and he's saying it while apologizing. What an asshole. But he's knocking you hard in the gut with this volley of punches that knocks you back through the arena nearby the edge as you're just sort of holding your gut and having a little trouble catching your breath. And can you move your status track down 1, however you're going to mark that? So you should be moving it from ready to dirty as the dust from that's all been kicked up is sort of coming on you, and your drawing has a little of those little scratches they throw everywhere to sort of get battle damage on there, just to explain to people why I called it dirty.
He's roughed up.
Basically, yeah. And do you want to take a condition to wipe out any of that? Normally those make more sense closer down into combat or when they build together for a stronger punch later. But I'll ask just because first time playing.
I'm fine leaving it as is right now.
Alrighty then. So you've been pushed back. The announcer starts saying, only a few minutes in, it's already been an impressive bout. It looks like Curtis seems to be being pushed back though. Only at 1 strike and they already are on their last legs. Is this going to be one of the quickest final bouts in World Tournament history?
Curtis, when you realize the enormity of what's happening, Plessy looks down at you and says, "Take heart, Curtis. Remember, Rocky got his ass kicked by Apollo the first time."
Ugh.
I enjoyed that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I did too in my own way, don't get me wrong.
Awesome.
So for those listening at home, we thought it would be a good idea to show off the ultimate technique. So we're going to take a moment and actually just move forward the fight, because it's a desperation tactic, normally only used around the end of the battle. So we sort of agree there's been a bit of an exchange between the two of them. Battles in FEV are designed to be a little bit on the longer end, so we were never going to hit a 10-minute mark. So at this point in the battle, there's been quite a few exchanges. The arena's been roughed up. While Curtis is on their last legs, Plessy is only about beat up, which is after Dirty and First Blood. So they've still got a little bit more in them than Curtis does. They have a few conditions right now. Not too relevant since it doesn't come up in the move, but Curtis is obviously angry, which they had to do to protect themselves from not coming out. So the arena's been sort of blown up, broken apart. The announcer's been blown back a little bit, their hair roughed up, and so the announcer's there, his hair's all messed up. He's going, I think I may have spoke too soon earlier. This battle has stretched on and has been one of the most oppressive fights, but where could it go? It's clear that not much more can happen. I think it's fair to say that we're about to see the rousing conclusion. And that's when I think Curtis is about to pull out their ultimate technique.
Yes, and so what is an ultimate technique?
So the ultimate technique is, as I said a little earlier, is basically a desperation tactic. So its main usage is kind of like X Factor in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. It's what you pull out at the end, sort of pull yourself back. But in true shonen fashion, it's that classic, like, I'm going to hit you. Even though we've been fighting and clearly you've been kicking my ass this entire battle, I'm just going to hit you with literally everything I got, and whoever wins, wins. And that's essentially what you're doing. You're usually going to use this technique. You will only use it on your last legs, because this is a technique that is supposed to save you from getting knocked out. But you can just as easily just straight up lose the match.
All right. My ultimate technique that I've created is perfect blackmail, because I am always the scoundrel. My character has the one thing that will make my attacker stop and talk to me.
Okay, then. So at this point, you just roll 3d6, and essentially the thing about this desperation tactic is, just like in all those series, you're putting all your faith in this one roll, or this one attack.
So I think how this ultimate technique is triggered is Curtis is going to try to get into close combat with Plussy and get a standoff so they're face to face, and we're going to have a confession as the perfect blackmail. And he's going to say that. Do you want me to say what he's going to say or roll first?
I think it has more dramatic effect if you do it after you roll.
Okay.
It also might give you a chance to use your ties depending on how the roll goes, because you can always still use your ties afterwards.
It's true. So I'm going to make a roll. No bonuses. Well, thankfully, this is like the only time I've rolled good on this show. I've got a 10.
Wow.
Oh, good.
So I rolled a 10. So it's a success because it's a 9+, correct?
Yes.
So I think that they're in this like locked standoff position. So Curtis looks up towards where there's like a box where the owner of the tournament is watching. He's like, this guy, he put me up to fighting you. He wanted me to knock you down a peg. I'm so sorry we got into this mess.
What? He looks up at the owner who's eating this humongous bowl of ramen, and there's noodles that are just falling off the sides of the bowl, and he looks down at the two of us fighting for his profit. Plus he says, we need to take him down, Curtis. We need to do that right now. I forgive you. Of course I forgive you. I was going to win, but it's good that you were honest. I appreciate that. Let's go.
So wait a minute, the tournament ends like that one episode of SpongeBob where they hold hands and walk off the mat.
It's the power of friendship.
Shing!
That works for me, that's fine. So the announcer sees you both basically do a no contest and is just like, wait, no. As the guy who's probably in charge slowly realizes what's happening, but that would be a story for another day.
You bet. Well, thank you for facilitating some FEV fun for us. I really appreciate it. That was a fun little fight. Interesting to see how the mechanics tied together there. That's cool.
Oh yeah, it was really fun to go through that little demo, sort of show off a little bit about the combat. I'll just try to show you again a little bit of a narrative through the battle, because that's how we started this whole... let's do this like the wall. We're back where we started. Shows you a little bit of how you can have a narrative in a battle.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Little application of our previous conversation.
Kamala, if our listeners want to follow more of your work, where can they find you online?
So when it comes to just my work, the main place, if you want up-to-date stuff, would probably be at Kamala Kara A1. So that's KAMALAKARA1. I also have a blog that I haven't used in forever, but I do still have an up-to-date project page on that, fngsite.wordpress.com. That project page is pretty accurate. It also has a lot of my fan works on there if anyone ever wants to look at it. I'm also working a lot with the Far Horizons Cooperative. They're the ones who published this game. They're likely to be the ones who publish my next game. I have a little plan, actually, of games. Not all of them are going to be PBTA, just so you know, but they're probably going to be the publishers of the next one. And that's their Twitter is at Far Horizons Co-op.
Thank you so much, Kamala, for coming on Plus One Forward and sharing with us friendship, effort, victory.
Well, no, thanks for having me on. This was really fun.
And thank you again for coming on.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, metal version, and Drowning Attitude. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that new issues of Codex are now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Codex is the Gauntlet's bi-monthly role-playing game magazine. Each issue is organized around a theme and stuffed with brand new material for your table, including original games and supplemental material for games like Trophy and Brindlewood Bay. Check out Codex by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. Your pledge not only gets you Codex and other Gauntlet publications, but it also supports all the important work we do in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. If you'd like to try before you buy, there's always a free issue of Codex available on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you're looking for back issues, you can find them on DriveThru RPG, including in reduced price bundles. Thanks.